not a very good PowerPoint.
All right, go ahead. I'm going to turn off
All right.
the picture. I recommend everybody do that. Just it records, the quality is better. I mean, we do have quality faces, but it's the recording quality is better.
Yeah. Okay, so I am going to It always hides the thing I need, which is the presentation mode. I don't know where it went. Okay, not important. You guys can see the other slides. Doesn't matter. Okay, so welcome. I am Baroness Talina di Giuseppe da Fiesole, and I am from the Barony of Rivenoak and the Baroness of the Barony of Rivenoak in the Principality of Sinagua in the Kingdom of the West. And I am mundanely in Central California, or Northern Central California. So it's stinking hot here. It was 105 yesterday. The weather gods were a little bit nicer to us today, and it was like 95. But one of the things that happens in my kingdom is we have a really long camping season. So we start out when it is very cold, and we go through some very hot months, and then we actually end in November when it is cold again. So having some sort of cloak or some sort of warm thing in your wardrobe, I think is really helpful and important. And it's also one of those types of things that this whole series that Sarah has put together is targeted towards newcomers. So I think that a cloak is one of those items that anyone can make. And in our heads, we like to super complicate it, but it is such a simple garment that hasn't actually changed that much over the years. So we're going to kind of start out by taking just a really quick look at a very poor PowerPoint that at least gives us a few kind of images of sort of what some cloaks and period look like. Because I think a lot of folks, when they think of a cloak, they think of a very sort of wizardy thing with a big hood, which is ultimately not really common in the SCA period. Those really tend to come up if we see them in a medieval context. They're often in those sort of Victorian versions of what like the Renaissance looked like. So I want to kind of take a look at what some of the more common cloak shapes are. And I've got some examples, and we'll go through and talk about things like fabric and all of that. And I apparently, there we go. I can present. Yeah, we win. Okay, so cloaks. So your choice of cloak probably doesn't necessarily have to, but it probably you want to kind of coordinate with the style of clothes that you might prefer to wear. I also apologize if you can hear my dog barking in the background. He's got feelings. So here are some examples of what a Roman sort of appropriate cloak might look like. So you can see I have 3 masculine examples, and those are all going to be sort of square rectangular garments. That is something you're going to see over and over and over again. And then in terms of feminine dress, for Roman times, you're going to see something, it's typically referred to as a palla, which is a large rectangular piece of cloth, and it could be light, it could be heavy. So depending, I think, on sort of seasonally what you need and where you are. So those are kind of some things to keep in mind if that is a style that you like and it's hot in the day and then it cools down quite a bit at night. It's good to, and you want to have like this cohesive look. It's nice to have a cloak or a good palla that you can add on as a layer. So Norse, we have a lot, and I was going to kind of put some reenactor pictures. We have a lot of reenactorisms, and we have somewhat limited sort of extant sources, but I picked out a few items that also kind of gave us a look at cloaks or shawls. And you can see we again here are seeing what is probably a rectangular shape. And here we have that same, as you saw on the Romans, where we are sort of clasped at one side and probably have a rectangular shape. So when we get further on, and you can really see we're not changing a lot. So most of these are from the Bayeux Tapestry, and then I've got one that's kind of Byzantine, but these sort of 11th century examples, you can again see these rectangular cloaks. We're really seeing quite a bit of that. This one may be shaped in a semicircle, but it could also be potentially rectangular. As we get into sort of the 14th, 15th century, that's when we start to see a little bit more shaping. And we get to see a little bit more variety. So I really enjoy these very short little capelets that we'll see on women sometimes. But we will also see this is sort of a circular cloak and on this pilgrim that has buttons that go down. And we're also seeing on women, we are seeing, or in feminine dress, we're seeing sort of more like round shaped mantles, but we are still seeing some of the more rectangular shapes as well. So those are sort of some of the examples, and I'm going to get out actual pieces of stuff and we'll look at it. But and then one thing I wanted to kind of touch on, because I think, so one of the things you'll notice, I only really have one person here that has a hood, and that is a separate hood. So having a hood on a cloak is not a terribly common thing that we really see throughout the SCA period. There are occasional examples, but it's definitely the exception versus the norm. So one of the things to kind of keep in mind also, because these are very attractive and people love to put lots of decoration on a cloak, there are examples of very ornate, these are called copes. They're basically ceremonial or religious, like vestry garments. So this one with the lions is a coronation garment, and that top one is a religious vestry. So just something to keep in mind as you look at inspirations, that sometimes you are looking at things that aren't real garments. They're purely sort of decorative for a ceremony. Okay, so that was all that I put into that very slapdash slideshow, but I just kind of wanted to give at least some little looks at what some of the shapes might be. And so now what we wanted to do is kind of get into what we need to do to actually make some of these things, and sort of what is easy, what's available, and sort of what makes it the most accessible. So I'm gonna, hey Sarah, would you like pin me so I'm big for people? So I'm gonna get up and do stuff.
I'm sorry, can I pin you just so what?
Pin the picture,
Yeah.
highlight, whatever it's called.
Yeah, depends the yeah, this one's pin. I think highlight is
Yeah, I can't remember.
Google.
But anyways, because I'm gonna stand over here. So what I have gotten out in general is got a handy dandy dress form here. Can everybody still hear me? Are we good there?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, perfect. So when we think about, so the first thing to think about when you're kind of picking a cloak is practicality and style. So I think most people start out with a kit that includes sort of your often sort of generic medieval, so sort of your tea tunic, sort of simpler, so things that are a little bit more on the Norse or sort of Norman, that sort of vein of things. So as we were looking through some of those inspiration pieces, those earlier eras, really until we get quite a bit later, sort of into the 14th, 15th century, we are primarily seeing sort of rectangular cloaks. So if you are like, I am going to an event and I am going to wear this sort of generic medieval clothes, or I've got, you know, a Viking kit or whatever, the easiest thing to do is to do a rectangular cloak, and those can come in a lot of ways. So I have sort of a collection of things to sort of show you what that can look like, because this doesn't have to be a sewing project. So one of the things that is really easy to do is to find a somewhat appropriately sized throw blanket. So this is just a blanket in kind of an attractive color that seemed pretty neutral to me. And it is, oh, maybe 50 inches by 70 inches. So it's not huge, but it's big enough. And so something like this can go on either under one arm and sort of pinned at the shoulder. So that gives you a very, and this idea where we're closing our cloak kind of at our shoulder over our dominant hand. So think your sword arm. You're going to make sure that that is free. This is a very, very common look that we'll have. This one has a little bit of fringe, totally fine. And so this, either putting your other side below your armpit, do it myself. So I'm gonna knock over my dress form though. Let's not do that. It's very light. It's still fun. So either like this, where our cloak is going under our armpit, which is not as warm, right? And we still have this dominant arm completely free. Or if it is colder, you can certainly put your cloak over this arm. And we still have this sort of opening here for our dominant arm. So that's a really, really good option, right? So if you are I'm going to continue using this random blanket. So let's say you're like, oh, I know a hood. I don't have time to sew anything. I know that something with a hood would be better because maybe it's a rainy event. So one of the ways that you can achieve that is if you take your blanket or your square of cloth or whatever, and you fold it over so that you've got maybe 10 or 12 inches overhang, so if you can see that, then with that bit to the outside, put it over your shoulders, pin it here, and now you can take that bit that you have folded over and bring it up. So this is actually typically what we're seeing when we see something that looks like a hood in portraiture. We're kind of seeing a fold of fabric that's coming up more often than we're seeing necessarily a sewn on separate hood. But this is very cozy and could certainly keep rain off of you. So that's kind of option one. One of the other things in that same vein is that sometimes you would like a cloak because you would like that layer for sun protection, you would like that layer for style. So this is another kind of finished scarf out of linen. It has like woven in silk. I got it at the thrift store the other day. So this is another piece that I could do something very similar with, or I can even just wear it draped over the head, done around. That is still essentially a cloak. This is much lighter, but going to keep the sun off of me. So that's sort of really like that is really the core to wearing a rectangular cloak. You want it to be a length so that the like tips of the fabric aren't going to drag on the ground. And if your piece of fabric is too long and you don't want to cut it up, which is just fine, especially if the edges are already finished, you just fold over a bit so that you are not getting pieces that are going to touch the ground, because that's not going to be ideal. So the next sort of other shapes are when we look into sort of round cloaks. So I have a couple of mine out. So this cloak, the dog has come in to yell at us. We'll see what happens. So this cloak is what I refer to as my consorting cloak. I don't know if you can see, it is a half circle. And so even when we get into this sort of large half circle, I can still, depending on what I'm wearing, wear it different ways. So if I happen to be wearing Romans, I will still bring this under one armpit and pin it at the corner, even though it is a circular cloak. And that still gives me versatility. This particular one could also be worn sort of straight on in your kind of classic cloak look, right? These circular cloaks are going to be a touch less versatile, and generally speaking, are going to require you to cut up your fabric. This one I wear because it matches my champion's clothes, and so sometimes I wear it as a consort, but it's not necessarily one that I find to be a super practical garment. So I have another semicircular cloak that is a 3/4 circle, and I will tell you, I made this, and I spent money on expensive fabric, and I made this when I first started playing, and I have worn it like twice. So this is your cautionary tale cloak. This, I think, is much closer to what people picture when they think of a cloak. So this is a 3/4 circle. It's got a clasp at the neck. And so you put it on and you feel very hobbity, right? Very classic look. Let me tell you why I don't wear it very often. It is so much fabric and it's really heavy. It's much heavier than it needs to be. And all of this fabric that's just hanging around, unless it's really the opulent look that you're going for, is in the way. At a camping event, which is when I really need a cloak or some sort of warmth, this is really suboptimal in a porta-privy. Like porta-john, these like big round, this is 3/4, some people will make a full round. That is a lot of fabric to be wrestling. So if it is the specific look that you're going for, great, but I would caution you that it is not as versatile as a simple rectangular cloak. It also, because of sort of the way that the amount of fabric involved, can't really be worn in any other styles other than just clasped as is. So I'm going to show you the actual thing that I really wear. Most of the time I actually wear a coat, but the cloak that is in my camping box is actually a completely unfinished piece of thrift store wool folded in half. And I take it and I pin it like this, and it keeps me very warm. So this sort of thing is actually going to be your most practical item. And so, like I said, we most of the time are not seeing cloaks with hoods on them. I know that Sarah has sort of in her schedule of classes later on, she has hood making classes. So typically, if it's very cold, I kicked up a lot of dust picking up these old clothes that I don't wear. So this is a Norse hood, which I believe is what they're going to teach in that class. So this is the thing I would wear in combination with a cloak if it is very cold. There are also later period options. Okay, so I'm going to take all of these things off of my chair and sit back down with you. Those things were all on my chair. So the next thing to really consider, so that's sort of the general shapes. A square or rectangle, oh, it's very bright right here. A square or rectangle is going to be your most versatile shape. A square actually is a little bit harder to work with than a rectangle that is sort of a moderate size. Circles are okay, but keep in mind how much extra fabric you have and whether or not that ends up feeling practical. So a lot of money in yardage of wool that I'm not actually actively using to stay warm. So sort of the next overall concept is to think about what we might want to make a cloak out of. Personally, for cloaks, I am not inclined to do a lot of sewing because this is a rough and tumble item. The other advantage to having like a rectangular cloak is I usually make them sort of throw blanket size, and I use that as an additional blanket on my bed at night. So in terms of fabrics, if you don't want to finish, you can either find a blanket that is a suitable size. Thrift stores are great for that. A lot of throw blankets. If you're sensitive to wool, you can use something that's synthetic that you like the feel and weave of, and that works really well. If you don't have access to that and you're like, what I really want is something incredibly soft, it's okay to use polar fleece. Be a little bit careful around fires because it will melt, but it is perfectly fine. The advantage, so this is just, if you use a slightly higher quality of fleece, it does look a little bit better, but this is kind of a nicer fleece in a fairly muted color. And the advantage of something like this is that you don't have to hem it. You can just cut it. You just cut it and it's fine. It is a great option, especially as kind of starter garb where you can upgrade as you go, but it comes in a 60-inch width. So really with say 1.5 yards, you right there have your cloak. It will not be as warm as say a wool cloak, but that's okay. It really depends on what your needs are, what your budget is, and what you have access to. And don't you let anybody shame you on that. If you would like to have wool, wool can be really hard to get a hold of, and it can be expensive to buy yardage of wool. So a really nice option for making cloaks are going to be army surplus blankets. This one I got off of Amazon for I think $25. It is, oh, I kept the tag. It is 62 inches by 84 inches. So I could potentially, if I wanted to cut it apart, I could cut it in half so that I had 62 inches by 42 inches. And that would make a perfectly acceptable cloak. This one, which I was not expecting, actually came with a nice blanket stitch all the way around. So my inclination, if I were to use this one, which if you do go this route and buy like the army surplus blankets, wash it. It has a lot of sort of treatment on it. Don't be super afraid to wash and dry these sorts of already felted wools. But this folded in half if I don't want to cut off that pretty edging that's already on there, or just folded in half because I don't want to like, or cut in half, sorry, because if I wanted to make two, is actually going to be a pretty nice length for most people in terms of being able to kind of go around. You just want to be able to meet your ends. And so as you're thinking about, and it's really easiest to do just with a piece of fabric to drape it on yourself, is to sort of figure out what feels comfortable kind of in that under armpit zone. And if you decide to wear it over your armpit, doesn't matter. Where you actually need sizing is to make sure that you have enough room sort of for the chest. So this at sort of 62 inches by 42 inches is a pretty reasonable size for a lot of people, as long as you're not going to get a lot of coverage. But if you needed it larger, you could go kind of the other direction. So this is a really nice option to have a very affordable, nice heavy cloak. Most of the time when you are going to wear these warmer, it's very sunny right there. When you're going to wear these kind of warmer overgarments, you're probably going to be really fully clothed. Like for me, this is like a little bit itchy because it's hot in my house, so I'm wearing a tank top. But normally, I don't worry about lining a cloak for the most part because I'm going to be wearing it over layers of clothing. It's unlikely that I'm going to wear it against my skin. If you are particularly sensitive to the fabric that you're putting on the outside, if you really like the look of it being lined, which is fine, you can line it. I do recommend, if there is any swinginess to it, that you don't actually go with linen to line, because it actually gets kind of clammy. Linen is very cooling, and sometimes that starts to counteract the warmth of the wool. But lining it with something that feels comfortable against your skin. And I will say that there is actual specific medieval documentation on this idea of lining, of using linen as a barrier against itchy wool. It's in the Tacuneum Sanitatis. But you don't necessarily have to line as long as you are sort of covered with your other clothing. The other thing that I might do is, so we've looked at some fabrics that don't need to be hemmed, right? So a really like a boiled wool that's very felted doesn't need to be hemmed. It doesn't unravel. And the same with if you were to go with like polar fleece. But if you are cutting a fabric that is going to unravel, you kind of have two options. You can hem it, right? And if you wanted a lining, that's the point at which you would probably lay your lining with it and kind of hem it in. Or you can, if you want to finish the edges, but you want something more decorative, you can actually take a contrasting color. So if I'm doing a wool cloak, what I might do is I might take a different color in silk and use that as the edging just along the edge, in the way that you would sew on bias tape. I tend to cut mine straight, which is a little bit more of a historical practice. Doesn't really matter. You could even use commercial bias tape to do that same thing, where you are just sort of lining the edge. If you don't know how to sew on if you don't know how to sew on that style of edging, the easiest thing to do is to look up videos for how to sew on bias binding. Sometimes one of the hardest things about learning to sew and about learning costuming in general is you don't know what you don't know, so you don't know what to look for. So if you are wanting to sort of put I don't bring anything up that actually that has sort of a contrasting edging, then looking up videos on how to sew on a bias binding is probably going to be the easiest way to learn. And obviously asking your folks in your area is a great option too. Personally, I am toxically independent, so I always want to be able to look it up. The other options, of course, for finishing sides, if you have a fabric that doesn't unravel, but you want a little bit decorative, you can do a blanket stitch around the edge, which is just, it's attractive. And usually you'll want to do that if you're working with a wool fabric, you want to do that with a wool so that it kind of can sort of knit into itself a little bit and sort of gather together. So the next component, after thinking about what general shape we want and what types of fabrics are available and suitable, is considering what type of closure is practical. So I think you probably noticed that I only had a closure on one of those cloaks that I showed you. So let me grab that one. So much fabric. Um, so it is certainly an option to put kind of a hook clasp. This one is, very inexpensive, like from Joann's, but there are lots of really cool options that you could get off of Etsy or from a merchant at an event. But what happens when you do put a closure like this, like a hook on your cloak, is you are limited in the different ways in which you can wear it. But totally an option. It's a sew on hook. What I tend to use, and this is appropriate really from kind of, we have Roman examples very early. We have Norse examples, and we have examples that come through into sort of, I think, like the 13th, 14th century is going to be like a penannular brooch. You could also do something like a fibula, so kind of a fancy pin. But I think this is by far the most common closure that you'll see. And wait, sorry, I messed up my own view. All right. So this is a penannular brooch. It is the sort of thing that you could buy from someone off Etsy. You can buy them off of Amazon. You can often buy them from vendors. You can also make them yourself. So this is one that I made as like a largesse item. Did I make this? No, we made these in baronial largesse. So the way that this works, because I do think this is an important thing to know, because this is not a huge one. This is the size I use for a cloak. Some people get real big ones that are more like 4 inches across. Doesn't really matter. It'll have a pin and then a ring. Sometimes it has a ring that's totally closed, and sometimes it has a ring that's open. So an annular brooch will be closed, a penannular brooch is open. Most of the time you see these penannular brooches. So the pin will go through your fabric. Usually they are not sharp. So what you want to do is, if you're trying to take this not particularly sharp pin, and you don't want it to be needle sharp anyways, because then you're going to poke people if you hug them. So what I'll do is I will take my fabric where I want to put it through, and I will put the tip of the pin against the fabric and wiggle it. I'm going to wiggle it until it goes through. And because what we're trying to do is poke between the fibers and let them move aside. So instead of just trying to like brute force push it through, I'm gonna gently wiggle it until it slides through. And then, so you're gonna take your pin and you're gonna get it all the way through on both sides. And then you're gonna take your brooch portion and you're gonna rotate, it's kind of a small piece of fabric to do this with. You're gonna rotate it so that the opening can slide around the pin, and then rotate it kind of up. So now our pin, get this at a funny angle. So now our pin is being held in place by the fabric. And so you want to have kind of enough fabric that it will still hold everything in place going through there. And again, like some people have large ones. If you have a very close knit fabric or like a close woven, tightly woven, there we go, fabric, and a very large brooch that you're trying to use to close your cloak or something else, what you probably want to do is actually add eyelets. So you can choose exactly where you think is a comfortable spot for it to be to close up, and then you can actually use an awl, put through appropriately sized holes, and finish them off by using basically using thread and sewing around that opening that you have made to hold it open. And that'll keep you from poking lots of different holes in your fabric. So you can kind of see, I don't know if you'll be able to see, but there are sort of holes in this fabric from where the pin has gone through. but I don't find that to be a huge issue if what I am doing is using using it on a very practical garment. You might not prefer to use something like this on a very fine garment. So if you are making like a silk cloak or something like that, something very decorative, then having one of those sewn-on closures probably just makes more sense. So those are kind of primary things. Do people have questions or thoughts on the matter? Because I think that's kind of what I've got on terms of cloaks.
You can put a
Sarah, I was
question
very fast.
in the chat. You can come on and ask her.
Yeah.
Either works.
And I know, like, overall, this is super simple. There's nothing kind of complicated or really specific. And overall, really starting with that just length of cloth that you can wrap around yourself is the most practical place to start. I gave my mom for Christmas, I gave my mom a chunk of wool with a penannular brooch on it. And she was like, I don't get it. And then she's like, okay, every event that I have been to, I have put this on and it is warm. And then I put it over my bed as an additional blanket. I'm like, yep. So ideally, when you think about a cloak, you want those sorts of practicalities in mind, in addition to sort of the look that is most cohesive with your particular like outfit and style that you're going for. Because we want to be functionally and pretty. Oh, fur-lined cloaks. Yes. I didn't end up with any pictures, but there are definitely examples of fur-lined cloaks. And if generally speaking, you know how people like to like take furs and drape them over themselves? It is much more documentable to actually have your fur on the inside. So lining is, I definitely, when I was looking through examples, was finding a fair amount in sort of the 12th century and on through. And that's probably just because of the way that the drawings were done, but we'll tend to see as you look through manuscripts and you look through different artistic pieces, what you will see are rectangles on the insides of the item. And those are actually going to be basically like, those are the pieces of fur. So those are the, so when you see a series of rectangular like panels lining something, it's almost always indicating fur. So yeah, totally a reasonable documentable thing if you happen to live in a climate where that is something that is going to be useful to you. Also super nice in terms of something to add warmth to your bed. And yeah, so somebody else said when they were new, they thought circular or the half circle. Well, those can be the look you're going for. I caution against it in terms of a practical garment. You will just see a lot more documentation for these rectangular sort of cloaks coming throughout the years. Oh, I forgot one other closure. So if we are looking at a later period, so say you are doing like 15th century and you have a cloak that is generally going to be a little bit more than a half circle, so probably like a 3/4 circle, and usually not quite to the ground. You will see a closure that is, they will take it, and typically your closure again will actually be above your dominant arm, and you will actually have a series of buttons. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3 or 4, maybe 5, but not a ton. And you will just have buttons that go sort of from here to here. So sort of from the neck closure down to sort of where the top of sort of the yoke of a sweater might be. So usually just sort of maybe 6 inches, 4 to 6 inches. Sometimes you see them just with 1 or 2. With that style of cloak, you can also sometimes see sort of brooches that are more like plaque, like pins, that are then sort of one end and one end through on the sides. So that is also a great option. And there are some very cool folks making sort of reproductions that are actually fairly affordable of different sort of jewelry finds. And as you're sort of working through and putting together kit, and also I suspect that a lot of you are not newcomers, but folks who interact with newcomers, as people are putting together their kit, really considering what some of those little touches are that take you from costume into clothing. And so having the right layers, so having the different layers of clothing that are comfortable in your climate and that look correct and feel right to you. But having things like some of those smaller jewelry pieces, having your penannular brooches, are definitely those items that make it feel that feel good as you're putting together earlier, like in your beginning of your sort of putting together garb journey. So there is a response, a comment on the fur patterns in heraldry. So when you think of like the ermine and there's a few others, are interpretations of fur linings. And so again, we do really see fur to the inside of things versus like an exterior fur cloak. When you do see something that looks like it could be sort of a fur that is over someone, or a fur to the outside garment, it's often actually like a hair shirt. So it is just a very like scratchy wool, not necessarily but it's definitely a thing. And the other thing to consider, cloaks are awesome. I don't wear a cloak. I don't find it practical for myself normally. Like, unless I get really cold and I need something up against my neck. I personally, because when it is cold, what the garb that I have been wearing is roost. So I actually do a coat. So if you are a person who is like, I am so much more comfortable in a coat, having something, once you know how to make just a basic rectangular construction tunic, there are lots of tutorials on that. I'm sure Sarah's got a video wherein they went into that. You can actually make a coat by just cutting that down the center, pinning it closed. It's a really, really practical way to have that type of garment if it is something that kind of works with the type of garb that you are wearing and with your own personal comfort level.
One of the
Okay.
later classes is a rectangular construction tunic, and that's the one you just
There you
cut
go.
up the front. Works
Yep.
really well.
It does. And it is my favorite piece of like quick and dirty garb. Like I was seeing if I took mine and put it in the closet instead of leaving it out because it was on this chair that I'm sitting on. It is a super practical thing because again, I think it's really important to consider the difference between what sort of looks glamorous as a costume and what physically feels practical as a garment that I am going to walk around in the mud in. Because ultimately SCA clothes are truly clothes. As we get sort of into later periods, we will still see women wearing mantles, which are essentially cloaks, but we will often see women and more often see men wearing other formats of garment. And so you have also some cloak-like garments. This is not what this is out for. It's just because this knocking things over. It's just because this is a dress form that's out. But if you love the feeling of wearing a cloak, so this is my 1460s Italian, and it has a overgarment that is probably originally based on some of those cloaks where it can actually, it could, if you were cold, pull over your arms, but there are a lot of garments that aren't quite cloaks that serve a lot of the same functions. But yeah, so that's kind of what I've got. You can stop recording me now, Sarah.